Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to be here because when Lior and I came up with this idea to host this webinar, we thought, okay, maybe we'll have some people from Canada, some people from the Netherlands, and then we ended up having participants from all around the world. And we're so grateful to have you here with us. So, for those of you who don't know us, my name is Naama Blonder. I'm an architect and urban planner with Smart Density. We work on, we're architects, work on development approvals, and we're based out of Toronto, Canada. And Lior Steinberg, he's based out of Rotterdam, is an urban planner and the co-founder of Humankind, which is an urban design practice focusing on making cities better from active transportation to urban planning. And please connect with us on LinkedIn if we are not yet connected, and follow us on Twitter. Lior has an amazing Twitter account. You should definitely check it out. So for today, what we plan for you, because as you already saw, we have people from all over the world. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Canadian context and our major cities. Then we prepared 3 case studies for you. Please type your questions as we go. This is by all means very friendly conversation, very informal, and feel free to type your questions in the chat box, and hopefully we'll get to them. And if we don't, and you still have questions, email us. And let's get started. We will wrap up in about 45 minutes. So because, as I said, we have participants from all over the world, and you don't know Canada, but you definitely should. It's an amazing country. I wanted to give a brief introduction. And if you are Canadian, this is your time to grab coffee or stick with us to see how I talk about and introduce our cities. So Canadian cities are experiencing growth like never before. And most of it is thanks to immigration and the general desire to live in cities and urban centers with all the benefits that they could offer. So just in Toronto is the largest city in Canada, and I think the population exceeded the population of the city of Chicago, and by 2050 we will be larger than the city of Los Angeles. So we are really experiencing growth rapidly, and I was thinking of how I can, capture new development style and character of Toronto in one image, and it was a very hard and challenging job. But I chose City Place. It's a neighborhood in Toronto, and yes, it was developed over the last 30 years. But I think it brings a mix of everything that is a new development, how it looks and feels, because we have a mix of tall buildings and mid-rise. The materials is kind of what you see in this picture. But also I wanted to talk about the width of the street and the kind of ramping up or summing up the elements that create the street. And sometimes it gets to be really wide. It could easily be 38 meters, or if we're talking about a residential street, the minimum I've ever encountered in design in the city of Toronto was 18 meters wide, which is still for a residential street pretty wide if you think about it. So I thought, okay, what would be if I needed to create a list of the 5 topics that I think influence urban design the most? I would say, I think all of you agree that NIMBYism is kind of a cultural thing. NIMBYism, not in my backyard, stands for, yes, housing crisis, sure. Do we need more housing? Of course, but I don't want my neighborhood to change. It belongs somewhere else. Perhaps downtown, perhaps major streets, but not here. I like my neighborhood as it is. The other thing is policy and where we can actually build. Because in Toronto, 31% of the city designated as detached housing, which means all you can build is a single family house there, which is about a third. But if you compare it to the place that you can actually build high density development, mid-rise and tall buildings, it's a fraction of the city. So it's time for policymakers to really rethink and reimagine what policy should look like. And design guidelines, I think for me as an architect, plays a major role because yes, and some of you from other cities in the world would say, oh, I wish we had design guidelines. I wish someone would guide how new design should look like, and how the proportion between tall building and podium and facing the street and street wall should be in a guidelines. And I agree with you, but here sometimes I feel that it just lacks creativity and prevents us from just do something different because it needs to fit in a podium in a tower and to check all the boxes of the guidelines. The other thing I would say, construction costs be extremely expensive, drives design, and it's okay in a private market driven housing market, but at the same time, a lot of municipalities in Canada came up with the concept of design review panel, which is a peer-to-peer design critique the architecture style of the new proposed development, which I think is an amazing thing because it allows the architect to raise the bar of the design. And the last thing, parking requirements, which some of you would say doesn't really belong on that list because it's not at the same scale as the other four. But the city of Vancouver recently came up with a research that showed that 40% of underground parking is not even used. 40%. And when we talk about construction cost of underground parking being from $50,000 to $100,000 per spot, we're talking about something that really drives design. So it's time to perhaps rethink parking requirements and the use and dominant use of the car in our urban design. So Lior, I'm not making, as you see, I didn't make your life any easier. Please take it from here and teach us.
Is it better? Can you hear me now? Please give me a... Okay, let's see if it's getting better. Could you write me if you can hear me? A lot of people are sharing. Yeah, it's in. Up. Wow, we have a lot of people on the chat. That's nice. Thanks a lot, guys. So I was sharing that I went to Norway to give a talk, and we were presented by this change of a street, turning the street from a street for cars to a street for cycling and walking in a sort of a shared space. And the person from the municipality told us that they did this change in the Dutch way of designing streets. And I was very intrigued by this sentence because I live in the Netherlands, I work in the Netherlands, but I don't really know what it means, Dutch urbanism. And she said that she also doesn't really know, but it was about co-creating with residents. It's about mixing different mixing different users in the street, etc., etc. And what it makes me think is that there is actually nothing like Dutch urbanism. It is sort of a tradition that grew through the generations, and now it is what it is, and we can just learn a few lessons. And what I try to do in this webinar is to bring three elements, three building blocks that make a Dutch urban design, and to share with you and maybe discuss a little bit with you, Naama, how we can turn those design elements from the Netherlands and bring them to other contexts. So I will share today a sort of a Dutch street, the Wonerf, a new development in the Netherlands, a new neighborhood, and of course we'll discuss a little bit about the bicycle. Are you ready? Great. Okay, I'm starting, and I hope that everybody can hear me, so it's great. I will start with the Wonerf, or as most English speakers would say, the Woonerf. The Wonerf, it translates to living yard, but in the UK they would call it the living street. And a Wonerf is a sort of residential street where all the space is shared and paved for the use of pedestrians, residents, and cars. So cars are allowed to those streets, but if you look at the pictures, it doesn't really feel that it's a place for cars, but cars are allowed to enter those streets. There are four principles or design principles that are repeated in each one of those Wonerf. I will just cover them, and we can share later on a link with those guidelines. So the first principle for every Wonerf is those visible entrances. In the Netherlands, it's a sign, and this sign is legally means that cars are not allowed to drive more than 15 kilometers per hour, and they're also not allowed to drive faster than a person walking in front of them. But this is not enough, because you can put all rules that you want, but if you don't have really those design elements in place, it will just not work. People will drive faster. And that's why you see those physical barriers around the street. The street is not straight. It's even if you really want to drive fast, it's impossible. You would have also those shared paved space all around the street from facade to facade, which really makes it feel like it is a sidewalk where cars are allowed to enter sometimes. And lastly, we would have those landscaping, which are public, benches and green landscapes, but also those private benches that are private, but they end up being used by the community, by neighbors. And the result, this image that I took from street films, this is something you really see if you cycle in the Netherlands around those streets. In the summer, you would see children playing, neighbors going out, and even now with this corona problem, you would see people sitting outside their doorstep and speaking with the neighbor on the other side of the street. One thing about Wonerf, because I know that they are circulating around the world, the guidelines and the pictures from the Netherlands, and I know that a lot of developers and cities try to apply them, but then end up having the sort of kind of a Wonerf that doesn't really work and clogged with cars, and people don't really know how it works. It is really important to follow those four elements that I spoke about, but that's about the street itself. You also need to think about the larger concept, and the larger concept is how those Wonerfs are situated in the neighborhood. You need to think about the circulation of the neighborhood, the traffic circulation, of course. And in this example from Groningen, a city in the north of the Netherlands, you would see I marked with red the main streets, which are not Wonerf, and then the side streets, the target streets where cars need to go to, those are Wonerf. So people live and play and go out and meet each other in the side streets, where traffic is only a target traffic, it's destination traffic, it's not a through traffic. And the main streets are just normal streets, as we know. And this is what makes a Wonerf really work. It's not only about the design itself, but also about the entire neighborhood.
So, Lior, I'm looking at it, and it's all great. And I have to say, the sarcastic person in me would say, Lior, this is great, but this is like 60s type of design. It's not going to work in today's new development. Municipalities won't allow it, developers won't allow it, and users won't allow it. What do you have to say about that? Beyond the fact that it looks imaginary to me. Like, I wish it looks so family friendly, and this is something that the city of Toronto is definitely in the radar. How we incorporate and make cities and neighborhoods more family friendly, because the affordability, the housing affordability Toronto is facing is similar to other major cities, and families are no longer could just buy a house wherever they want, and condos becoming the right alternative for them. So how we make new developments more family friendly, this is definitely one of the elements. But what do you have to say about is it contemporary enough?
Well, so yeah, those pictures that I just showed you are from old neighborhoods. Those neighborhoods are probably hundreds of years old, the old part of towns, although those streets were designed in the 60s and the 70s. But I think that this idea of living and having this great quality of life in in your street, you don't need to really travel to a playground somewhere far away from the neighborhood or far away from your street. You have it on your street. It comes back through different new developments in the Netherlands. And I can share with you a completely new development in the Netherlands, a new neighborhood, 12,000 people in Utrecht without private cars. This is an example of how you can take those elements, maybe some of them a bit outdated in terms of technology and how we build new buildings, and maybe the heights of buildings, and you can incorporate it in a new development. So Utrecht is the third largest city, or the fourth largest city in the Netherlands. And it is growing like all major Dutch cities, and they are building new neighborhoods today. It's not enough just to build one building here or one there. They are taking terrains of empty land and building new neighborhoods, and they try to do it in a dense, livable way, because they know that it's not enough just to build residential neighborhoods outside the city and get everybody drive their car to the city. So this new neighborhood in Utrecht, the Merwede, will be this sort of car-free, completely car-free neighborhood. 12,000 people will live in those in a neighborhood where you're just not allowed to drive your car in. You can just go around it with a car, and in the neighborhood there will be parking spaces, but the parking maximum will be 0.3 per apartment. The parking maximum. So we still see cities with parking minimums of 1 or 2 cars per apartment, and here we will have a parking maximum. And also those parking spaces will not be used by the residents, only by guests. So the residents are not allowed to park their car in the neighborhood. They will use shared cars that will be situated around the neighborhood in mobility hubs, and they will have a sort of a subscription to use shared cars or shared bicycles, and their daily life will be just like so many people in Utrecht and other Dutch cities, using walking and cycling. And when they really need a car, because we all sometimes need a car, we're not against the concept of car, just against of the daily addicted use of cars, but I think it is important to be able to use it when needed. They will be able to use a shared car. Another important thing about this neighborhood, you see the public space is really well thought. It is very green, and you can achieve those great public spaces when you don't spend so much space on cars and roads in the neighborhood. The houses, this is something that I really like. It's not only that each building is different in terms of architecture, but it's also in terms of the apartments, the sizes, the heights, and also the policy, which is planned, a sort of top-down policy, makes sure that 30% of the houses will be for social housing, controlled rentals, and the rest of the apartments will be either for the free market, for rental, or for buying apartments. And And lastly, I want to again take you to the street level of this new neighborhood in Utrecht. And what you would see here is that first, and I think this is quite typical Dutch urban design, I would say, is that the ground floor is programmed. It's not just residential neighborhood. You would have cafes there and a library and other shops, and it's interesting to go in. But I think that it's also interesting to see how narrow those streets are. Well, I don't see them as narrow, but if you compare it to the image you showed me before from Canada, from Toronto, it would be a quite narrow street. And you can also see those in the street sections that were published by, this is from the website of the municipality. You see street sections of 15 to 20 meter wide. And this really allows you to create those lively public spaces. Not only those public spaces are not only without cars, they're also small enough in order to create this interaction between the people. This is another sort of a street, and I can share with you later a link to the plans of this neighborhood.
So, this is again, and the first time I saw it when you shared it with me, I couldn't believe it, to have a neighborhood with no cars, or at least in the peripheric, and the ratio, I am 0.3. I'm aware of only one project in Toronto, which is an affordable housing led by the city. Otherwise, we have much higher ratios, and especially when you spread it over a neighborhood, doesn't exist in Toronto. And I'm thinking, so can you address how? I have two questions, and I'm kind of reading the chat as well. The first one is a technical question: how would a road with the cars looks like? And the second question is, okay, how do you make that cultural shift, convincing people that they actually don't need their car or use car share? Because this is North America, and people own cars.
Yeah, so this is something I get a lot working around the world, talking with cities, with decision makers about turning maybe neighborhoods or streets to car-free, or reducing the amount of driving lanes. And you see that even in forward-thinking Toronto, it's quite difficult to reduce the amount of driving lanes, right? So you would have probably 2 driving lanes to each direction. And I don't have it here in the presentation, but even in that neighborhood, you would have in the periphery of the neighborhood one street with a tram or a bus, public transportation. So you would have 2 lanes for those, and then you would have maybe 1 lane for cars for each direction, and of course a bi-directional bicycle lane in each side of the road. So this is something that, yeah, there are still streets that have car traffic outside the neighborhood, but even they are quite, I would say, car limited. Difficult how to put it, but compared to Canada, they have much less cars. And this is quite normal in the Netherlands. So having those sort of next to neighborhoods, sort of those calmer, smaller streets, but it is still difficult to convince, even in the Netherlands, people to give up their parking space. And that's because Dutch people are not special. It's not that Dutch people are more unique or they love the earth more, so they would they would be up to give up their parking spaces if they're asked for. They're just like Canadians or Americans or British or German people. If they have a parking space in front of the house and they're used for that and they own a car, and you come to them and ask them, let's get rid of this parking space, they will also resist. And then you need to be a bit more creative on how you do it. I can share another project that actually we did at Humankind to work on that. So this is a project from Rotterdam. I don't know how many of our listeners are aware of Rotterdam. This is actually a picture from Amsterdam, but we'll get back to that later. We did a project in Rotterdam, and Rotterdam is a city, second largest city in the Netherlands. It was rebuilt after World War II because the city center was bombed. So it was rebuilt in the 50s and the 60s with the car in mind. It means very wide streets. It means a lot of roads in the city center, high buildings, and it reminds, in a way, sort of a North American cities. But the Dutch, they know that cycling is important. This is the way forward in terms of urban mobility. And I always like to say that a smart city has nothing to do with sensors or artificial intelligence. It's more about a smart city is when a child can walk or cycle just freely, even without his parents really close to them, and it's a safe thing to do. And with this thought, we came to this street in Rotterdam. The municipality asked us to help working together on putting a bicycle lane in this street. This street is quite in the city center, and in the Netherlands, it's not very common to have such a wide street without bicycle infrastructure. And just like anywhere else, also in this street, anywhere else in the world, also in this street, the municipality have been trying for several years to introduce a bicycle lane, and the owners of the shops and the residents didn't agree. There is a parking lane there on the right side, and people were against of removing it and turn it into a parking lane. And what we did is thinking with our partners from Drift, the local university, and from Street Events, which is like a sort of company that makes events on the street. They're also partnering in those. This picture I took from DAC, which is a yearly party on the rooftop of a parking space in Rotterdam. We know how to make parties and great public spaces for a short time in the city. Why shouldn't we turn it into like sort of intervention in the street? And that's what we did exactly in that street. We worked all together with the municipality, and we applied a very quick bike lane instead of a parking lane. Not instead of a parking lane, I'm sorry, but we had to remove a few parking spaces in order to make it happen. Actually, I think we removed along this street around 10 to 15 parking spaces, and we just installed a bike lane. And we also replaced parking spaces with those sort of like very quick parklets that we did together with people in the neighborhood, creating more green spaces and sitting spaces around the road. We also we replaced the car parking space into this sort of colorful parking space, which is also used as a parking for cargo bikes. So you don't always need to use the car if you go to shopping. You can also bring your cargo bike, which are common in the Netherlands. And we've been doing these interventions around the city. So that was one example. Here's another example, turning a two-way car street into a sort of a one-way street, or a sort of a shared street where it is very clear where the bicycles are going, and replacing, if I remember correctly, 12 parking spaces with grass, which was much appreciated by many of the residents. Sitting places for the neighborhood instead of parking. I think that was a great way to show the value of public space. And these sort of interventions, I'm about to finish here, were just to show people, okay, you're used to that. Even if you're Dutch, you're probably not convinced that we can remove parking spaces. But yes, it can happen. And actually, one of those streets was already turned into a street with a bike infrastructure because the shop owners were really happy with the results.
So what I'm hearing here, and I'm trying to summarize, and I took a few notes, combining it with the notes on our chat. So I have to say, what I love about Toronto, and I've been living here for 6 years already, is that we always try to raise the bar, and we always like to critique ourselves and try to make Toronto a better city. That is the number one key to how we get better. And Toronto, I encourage everyone from this webinar, I hope we kind of make it a good teaser for Toronto and Rotterdam. I know I really want to visit Rotterdam after this webinar. But what I'm hearing, first of all, is that we have the same issues no matter where. Like you're facing, if you need to convince people in Rotterdam to have a bike lane over a parking lane or some parking spots, we're facing the same problem. So who am I to complain? And I like the try fast and learn as you go and from real life. That is something, a tactic that we also heard from the transportation planner from the city of New York about how they incorporated bike lanes in New York, was kind of overnight with paint, and that's it. And another key, major key is that I'm hearing from you is that high density could be in a mid-rise form over other space, just shift and distribute density differently over roads. And when we were preparing this webinar, you said land is so expensive, so why you put road on it, right? I really like that sentence you said. And also, I like the fact that car share is the new private mobility that we are kind of is going to be pre self-driver cars that is coming and probably reshape our cities as well. So these are kind of the major key takeaways that I can think for Canadians, and we would love to hear what you have to say, guys, on Twitter or here in the chat box. And
I think that there are already quite a lot of questions down there.
Yes, so I think Lior, do you want to address some of the questions since we have time? Can you?
Yeah, I can pick up. I mean, there are quite a lot, so I'm trying to. Yeah. I'm scrolling up, but there is a. I saw that I'm sorry if I don't pronounce the name fine, but Gia Benny and Eric Post have both asked about the tactical urbanism. Are they temporary, and whether there was like a political resistance in the city to apply them. So first of all, the projects that I presented were temporary. They were called Happy Streets, and they were only for a few months. And I think that was also the power and of them. They were only for a few months. It was promised to everybody that it's just a trial, and after the trial, we will all be able to come back together and discuss now, after we saw how it works, if we want it to be permanent or not. And I think this also answers for the second question about political resistance, because once those projects are temporary, the political opponents are more open to maybe just try it for a short time and see, yeah, let's see if it works or not. You don't really need to fight to cancel a project because you know it will be only for a few months there. I think that's a big power of tactical urbanism in general. Shall I try to find more? Do you see more questions? There are so many.
Yeah, I'm trying to scroll down.
So, yeah, there are a few questions about communities without public transportation or very little public transportation. I don't know the context, so it's very, very difficult to say. Yeah, so okay. On this I have to answer because it was coming back twice about Snow City. So maybe I would ask you first. It's really snowing in Toronto in the winter, right? It is.
Which one?
In Toronto, it's really snowing, right, in the winter.
Oh, yeah.
So people here said that it's very difficult to build those Wohnhöfe, the Wohnhöfen, if in a snowy situation. I don't know. It's also snowing in the Netherlands. Maybe not as bad as in Canada, but it works well. I think engineers have solved those problems. And also when it comes to cycling, I think I saw someone here mentioning that cycling might be more difficult in the winter, but if you have great infrastructure and the right gear, the right clothing, you can also cycle in the winter. It shouldn't be a problem. And we do it also here in the Netherlands, and they do it up there in Norway, where I took the picture before, and I don't think that Canada is colder than Norway. So I think it can work also there. I think, yeah, I don't see any more questions. No.
Yeah, so I think, you know what, guys, we have our, sorry, we put our email address in this slide. We have tons of resources to share with you. If you need a specific case study, if you're from a municipality in Canada and you want to rethink or bring it as a brainstorming session, email us. You have both of our emails in this slide. And I think we can wrap it up. We finished before the time, which is amazing. I always like when that happens. I get my time back. So guys, thank you so much for joining us. Connect with us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and email us with any questions or case studies or inspiration you need. Thank you.
Thank you.